Assalamu alaikum and welcome back once again to Today in African History with Baba Shaka. I'm Baba Shaka and today is January 27th, 2021. And on this day, back in 1952, Ralph Ellison won the National Book Award for his seminal novel, Invisible Man. Right? Ralph Ellison was a 20th century African American writer and scholar, best known for his renowned award winning novel, Invisible Man. Ralph Ellison studied music before moving to New York City and becoming a writer. He published his best selling, acclaimed first novel, Invisible Man, in 1952. It would be seen as a seminal work on marginalization from an African American protagonist's perspective. Ellison's unfinished novel, Juneteenth, was published posthumously in 1999. Ralph Waldo Emerson was born on March 1st, 1914, in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and named after journalist and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ellison's father, Lewis, who loved children and read books voraciously, worked as an ice and coal deliverer. He died, unfortunately, from a work related accident when Ellison was just 3 years old. Ellison's mother, Ida, then raised Ralph and younger brother Herbert by herself, working a variety of jobs to make ends meet. In his future book of essays, Shadow and Act, Ellison described himself and several of his friends growing up as young Renaissance men, people who looked to culture and intellectualism as a source of identity. A budding instrumentalist, Ellison took up the cornet at the age of 8 and years later, as a trumpeter, attended Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where he studied music with his eye on becoming a symphony composer. In 1936, Ellison went to New York City over the summer with the intent of earning enough money to pay his college expenses, but ended up relocating. He started to work as a researcher and writer for the New York Federal Writers Program and was befriended by writers such as Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, and Aileen Locke, who all mentored the young fledgling writer. During this period, Ellison began to publish some of his essays and short stories and worked as managing editor for the Negro Quarterly. Ralph Ellison later enlisted as a merchant marine cook during World War II. Married briefly before, in 1946, he got married to Fanny McConnell, and the two would remain together for the rest of Ellison's life. Ellison started writing what would become The Invisible Man while at a friend's farm in Vermont. The existential novel, published in 1952, focused on an African American civil rights worker from the South who, upon his move to New York City, becomes increasingly alienated due to the racism he encounters. Upon its release, Invisible Man became a runaway hit, remaining on the bestseller list for weeks and winning the National Book Award the following year. With millions of copies eventually printed, the novel will be regarded as a groundbreaking meditation on race and marginalized communities in America, influencing future generations of writers and thinkers. Ellison traveled throughout Europe in the mid 1950s and lived in Rome for 2 years after becoming an American Academy Fellow. He continued writing, publishing a collection of essays in 1964, Shadow and Act, and taught at colleges and universities, including Bard College and New York University. He published his second collection of essays, Going to the Territory, in 1986, yet was stalled over the decades from completing his second novel, which he envisioned as a great American saga. Ellison died from pancreatic cancer in New York City on April 16, 1994. The novel that he had been working on prior to his death was released posthumously in 1999 and titled Juneteenth, with final shapings done by his literary executor, John Callahan, at the behest of Ellison's wife, Fanny. 3 days before the shooting was released in 2010, which offered a more comprehensive look at how the novel was shaped, along with a look at Ellison's full manuscript. Ellison's literary legacy continues to be highly pronounced. A massive collection of his essays was released in the fall of 1995, and Flying Home, a collection of short stories, was released in the fall of 1996. Years later, scholar Arnold Rampersad wrote a well received critical biography on Ellison that was published in 2007. Invisible Man continues to be held up as one of the most highly regarded works in the American literary canon. Ralph Ellison and his seminal book, Invisible Man, which won the National Book Award on this date, January 27th, back in 1952. Today's episode of this today in African history is dedicated to the English department at Bowie State University in Bowie, Maryland. For those of you who have already subscribed, I thank you once again. I really appreciate your continued support. For those of you who are yet to subscribe, please do so and leave a comment, leave a suggestion. And God willing, until tomorrow, this has been Today in African History with Baba Shaka. Masalam.